Had it not been for the archaic rules that govern Europe's nobility, then Christopher Lee would have held the title of Count. As it was, he could not inherit through his mother, but, by way of consolation, over the course of his long screen career, he would play more than one notable Count. Count Dooku in Star Wars, Count de Rochefort in The Three Musketeers, and, for Hammer Horror, Count Dracula. In his autobiography, Lee said of Dracula, "It was the one that made the difference. It brought me a name, a fan club, and a second-hand car." But he goes on to say that it also brought me the blessing of Lucifer, the third and final nail in my coffin. The relationship between Lee and Dracula is one of the most volatile between any actor and character, and is charted by the 9 films of one of horror's most successful franchises. Following the huge success of The Curse of Frankenstein, which we've already charted in another video, Dracula was the next obvious subject for Hammer Studios to mine. Peter Cushing, who had played Frankenstein, was a natural choice for Van Helsing, while Christopher Lee got the title role because he had, in his own self-deprecating words, done a competent job as the creature. As well as the 2 lead actors and director Terence Fisher, much of the Frankenstein team returned. Composer James Bernard provided a bold 3-chord signature for the Count, based on the syllables in the name Dracula. Production designer Bernard Robinson achieved the difficult double of economic opulence by redressing the sets, as you can more or less spot by keeping an eye on the staircase in the dining room, the entrance hall, the library, and even the graveyard. But perhaps the most notable returning contributor was screenwriter Jimmy Sangster. Tasked with adapting and condensing Bram Stoker's lengthy novel, Sangster made some brilliantly cinematic changes.
The Diary of Jonathan Harker.
The name Jonathan Harker is familiar to the many who know the book, establishing this as a faithful adaptation. But then,
I will forever end this man's reign of terror.
In the novel, Harker visits Dracula on business, but here, that is a front for his real mission to kill Dracula. Just over 10 minutes in, Sangster has pulled the rug from under us and given the film an urgency that many versions lack. But if Harker is hiding his true nature, so is his host. Dracula is a sinister figure, not least because his footsteps make no sound.
Now please, allow me.
But he is suave and charming.
I am Dracula, and I welcome you to my house.
At first. The superb first act of the movie plays like a short horror film in itself. Introducing Dracula as a character and as a genuine threat. As he disposes of the man we assumed was our hero. 2 years before, Alfred Hitchcock would pull the same trick in Psycho. The tone now changes as we finally meet the film's star.
We haven't asked for any help.
You need it all the same.
Cushing enters with a gentle authority, a contrast to Dracula, but also to his sharp, dislikable Frankenstein.
Yeah, you look like a teddy bear now.
In this midsection, Fisher explores the theme of innocence corrupted.
Sleep well.
I'll try.
Harker's demure fiancée Lucy says goodnight to her sister Mina, but then, in what Terence Fisher described as almost a ballet, she prepares for Dracula's arrival, inviting him in as if she is waiting for a lover. Sangster was clever in his selection of Dracula's victims. The unmarried virgin, the frustrated wife, already victims of repressed Victorian morality, waiting in their bedrooms for Dracula. This undercurrent of sexuality did not go unnoticed. The censors had already objected to the uncouth, uneducated, disgusting and vulgar style of Mr. Jimmy Sangster. Now they cut the attack on Mina, not because it was violent, but because, as you can see in the restored footage, Mina seems to enjoy it. Here she is the morning after her first encounter with the vampire.
Good morning.
Fisher's direction to actress Melissa Stribling was, just imagine you've had the best sex of your life. It turns out that Dracula has been hiding in the cellar with Mina's help,
Madam told me the other day that I must on no account go down to the cellar.
undermining the Victorian family from within. So it's no accident that, after Dracula is killed, Mina's wedding ring is deliberately highlighted, the marital status quo restored. Likewise, when Van Helsing stakes the vampire Lucy, he also restores her former innocence. These characters are being saved from something more than death. According to cultural historian Christopher Frayling, no one had previously considered the sexuality of Dracula. It is a creation of Hammer, Sangster and Christopher Lee. And though it would become more explicit throughout the franchise, it is this first film that best captures the furious tug between repression and eroticism. The studio's limited finances forced some unfortunate cuts, including the journey to England, so Dracula's castle ends up only a carriage ride from where his victims live, despite Harker's line,
"At last my long journey is drawing to its close."
But this is a small quibble, as is Michael Gough's mannered performance.
Is there no other way?
Dracula, or Horror of Dracula as it was released in America, remains a confident and chilling first outing.
I heard you call me, Aunt Lucy.
Yes, dear.
Abandoning the stately slowness of past versions to create what film historian Kim Newman called a swashbuckler with some shocks, Dracula flies to an action-packed climax as Lee and Cushing finally face off before the shocking finale, which can now be viewed with previously censored footage restored. The film hit cinemas in May of 1958. As with The Curse of Frankenstein, reviewers were revolted and outraged, but the box office was extraordinary, consolidating Hammer's position as purveyors of cinematic horror and saving its distributor Universal Studios from bankruptcy.
At last I have met Count Dracula.
Dracula is a film made by a team at the top of its game, but the role played by its star cannot be underestimated. Lee's performance second-guesses the audience by diverging from the accepted portrayal of Dracula. It's impossible to imagine Bela Lugosi in this scene. This Dracula is lithe and virile, almost animal, despite the uncomfortable contact lenses that left the actor almost unable to see and forever tripping over things. Though he is on screen for only 7 minutes and has just 16 lines, there is a charisma to Lee's portrayal that leaps from the screen.
You can have no idea what an evil man he is.
And yet, the normality is where he is most unsettling.
Charming. Charming.
Lee attended a screening in Times Square with a raucous and drunken audience who laughed at his first appearance. But when he spoke, the actor recalled, the ordinary conversational tone of the Count switched them off like a knob being turned on a radio.
Mr. Harker, I'm glad that you've arrived safely.
Though he based his portrayal on Stoker and had a copy of the book with him during this and subsequent appearances in the role, Hammer's Dracula is Lee's creation. But if Christopher Lee changed Dracula, then the reverse was also true. The Curse of Frankenstein had brought him to the attention of Hammer, but Dracula brought him to that of the general public, an attention from which, for better and worse, he would never slip. Christopher Frank Carandini Lee was born on the 27th of May 1922. His introduction to acting came as a boy at Miss Fisher's Academy, playing the title role in Rumpelstiltskin, the baby-stealing imp of grim fairy tale. Of this debut, Lee would later write, "I learned at the outset that the best lines are given to the baddies, and that these make the most impact on the audience."
I could have shot you down when you landed, but that would have been ridiculously easy.
After military service in World War II, bouncing around Africa and Europe, Lee turned to acting at the suggestion of his cousin, Niccolo Carandini, an ex-resistance fighter and now Italy's envoy to the court of St. James. For 10 years he scraped out a living in low-budget films and TV, getting his first starring role in 1955's Alias John Preston, made for the Danziger brothers, considered the bottom end of low-budget filmmaking.
Come here!
He won the role of the creature in The Curse of Frankenstein by virtue of his 6'5" height and the fact that his agent asked for slightly less than Bernard Bresslaw.
Look at that!
The following year, he appeared in Dracula, the film that would make his name. But when the sequel emerged in 1960, Lee was not in it.
Count Dracula, monarch of all vampires, is dead.
Exactly why gets a different answer depending on who you ask. In Jimmy Sangster's original script, Disciple of Dracula, the Count does appear, albeit in spirit form, to punish young vampire Baron Meinster for having the temerity to follow him, and he remains in that role on the finished film's poster. According to Hammer biographers Marcus Hearn and Alan Barnes, this version was shelved when Hammer decided to develop a proper Dracula sequel for Lee called Dracula the Damned. The Disciple of Dracula script was passed on to Peter Bryan, who added Van Helsing and made him the one who admonishes Meinster, summoning a horde of bats to consume him. Cushing objected to Van Helsing using magic, so this was altered by Edward Percy, who also rewrote Cushing's dialogue. Hammer recycled the horde of bats for 1962's The Kiss of the Vampire. One more rewrite by producer Anthony Hines, and The Brides of Dracula, as it was now titled, was finally ready. This time it is a woman who arrives at a mysterious castle, where she meets a captive man in need of help.
I can't come to you.
Played by Yvonne Monlaw, Marianne Danielle is a bold and active heroine, but sadly misguided, releasing the Baron Meinster, who has been kept prisoner by his mother.
What have you done? She's dead and he's free.
As in Dracula, this first act plays out as a brilliant short horror in its own right. And as it ends...
There's nothing to be afraid of now. I'm a doctor. Dr. Van Helsing.
Van Helsing confidently dominates the rest of the film, with Cushing building his meticulous characterization as the Doctor takes on a more paternal role.
Did you let him kiss you? Tell me.
It would be nice to think that an inconsistency between the first film...
If there were such things, they could change themselves into bats or wolves.
That's a common fallacy.
And this...
And some have the power to transform themselves into bats.
...shows him learning about vampires. Although Brides of Dracula is a misleading title, the film's female characters are unusually strong for Hammer.
Go on, get him. I bet you're after. Take him.
Frida Jackson as Greta is wonderfully creepy.
No, I can't help you. You've got to be strong.
And there is a rare note of pathos in the fate of Meinster's mother.
There is one release.
Played by veteran character actress Martita Hunt. Compared to the first film, the plot is somewhat diffuse. This character is never fully explained, a relic of an abandoned storyline. But what it really lacks is what you would expect.
I am Dracula.
It's hard to put into words what Christopher Lee has that David Peel doesn't.
I am Baron Meinster.
But to be fair to the actor, who was 40 years old when cast as the young vampire, this is largely to do with that much rewritten script, described by the BBFC as having been written by an insane but very precocious schoolboy.
My mother thinks of me as inhuman, doesn't she?
Meinster is still the Disciple of Dracula written by Sangster, the watered-down imitation who needs to be put in his place by the real thing. Without Lee's Dracula to provide that taste of real terror, the film feels a shade unbalanced as it reaches its spectacular ending. None of which stops The Brides of Dracula from being a hugely enjoyable film. But its real triumph is a visual one. This is one of Hammer's best-looking films, thanks to the superior cinematography of Jack Asher. Sadly, Asher's time-consuming perfectionism fell foul of Hammer's cost-cutting, with Anthony Hines writing to studio head James Carreras, "In view of our current production policy, I do not think we could afford Jack Asher." Although Hammer films always looked good, they would never again look as sumptuous as The Brides of Dracula. But What happened to that other mooted sequel, Dracula the Damned? This was before Christopher Lee's well-known antipathy towards the series, and while some have suggested he was trying to avoid typecasting, he almost immediately played a vampire again in the Italian comedy Uncle Was a Vampire. At the time, Lee was trying to forge a European career, making use of the many languages he spoke, so he may simply not have been available, but he usually made time for Hammer, appearing in The Hound of the Baskervilles, The Man Who Could Cheat Death, The Mummy, and The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll, all made around the same time. Exactly why Dracula the Damned vanished from production schedules is unknown, and the answer may be a combination of factors.
But I suspected that it would occur.
Whatever the case, Lee was certainly not idle. He played Sherlock Holmes in Germany and Fu Manchu in Britain.
Christopher Lee as the merciless Dr. Fu Manchu.
In Italy, he acted for Mario Bava in The Whip and the Body. And in America, appeared in the Alfred Hitchcock Hour. In Corridors of Blood, he co-starred with Boris Karloff. The pair apparently did not discuss the creature they had both played, but did become good friends and would later live next door to each other. For all this activity, Lee did not score a hit anything like the size of Dracula, and perhaps this was one reason that, after an absence of 7 years, he returned to his signature role with Hammer in Dracula, Prince of Darkness. Based on another unproduced sequel, Revenge of Dracula, the script was by John Sansom, a pseudonym for Sangster and Hines, who had both contributed, and Terence Fisher again directed. Although the mid-60s were golden years for Hammer creatively, money was tight, and Prince of Darkness was made for just £100,000. But this limitation works to the film's advantage.
Count Dracula.
Count Dracula.
This is the most focused of Hammer's Dracula films, largely based around the castle and concerned with the fate of a single family.
There'll be no mourning for us.
To a degree, it can be seen as taking that opening act of the first two films and basing the whole movie around it.
Hello?
4 lost travellers arrive at Castle Dracula.
Table is set for 4 persons.
Where they meet the Count's loyal servant, Clove. Played with gallows humour by Philip Latham.
Isn't your master joining us for dinner?
No, sir. I'm afraid not.
Is he indisposed?
He's dead.
That night, he performs an elaborate ceremony, and the goriest scene Hammer had yet shot. To resurrect his master. Lee's first appearance comes 45 minutes in. But his presence has pervaded the film through inference.
May he rest in peace.
Through James Bernard's leitmotif. Michael Reed's creeping camera. And the behaviour of the local villagers. The memory of Dracula has stayed with them, as that of Lee stayed with audiences. Barbara Shelley is wonderful as the straight-laced Helen.
I know it's none of my business, but that was the 3rd time you supplied everybody with drinks.
Who becomes a sultry vampire, flitting through Gothic sets. She is also the focus of the film's most memorable and most harrowing scene. Shelley threw herself into the scene, so much so that she swallowed one of her fangs, as she becomes the first Hammer vampire to be staked awake rather than as they sleep. And the last for whom the peace that comes after staking is shown, future films preferring to focus on the violent death itself.
If you wish to see the destruction of the horror spawned by Count Dracula, come with me. But I warn you, it is not a sight for the squeamish.
There was no Peter Cushing this time, and the film wisely introduces its Van Helsing substitute right at the start.
Barbarians!
Brash priest Father Shandor, played by Andrew Keir, is a great addition.
You are a superstitious, frightened idiot.
Fulfilling the same purpose as Van Helsing.
I warned you not to go anywhere near the castle, Mr. Kent.
But with a very different character.
Fortunately, my calling still allows me the luxury of a warm posterior.
He would have a life beyond the film as a comic strip in the House of Hammer magazine. But, for all that he appears late, very little, and speaks no lines at all, possibly at his own insistence, possibly because that was how Sangster scripted it, depending on who you believe, this is Lee's film. He strides through it with proprietorial confidence, easily picking up the character where he left off, as he heads for his inevitable fate.
Running water will drown him.
While other lesser vampires may be staked, Dracula himself always has a more interesting demise. The scene almost ended in tragedy, as Lee's stuntman Eddie Powell discovered that once the ice closed above him, he could no longer see to find his pre-placed oxygen tank. But the stuntman survived and continued to double for Lee for many films to come. Paired with the excellent Plague of the Zombies, Dracula Prince of Darkness was a major hit for Hammer and for Lee. Another reason for Lee's willingness to return to Dracula may have been the chance to play a different character. As a boy, Lee's well-connected mother and stepfather would occasionally drag him from bed to introduce him to important guests. He would later learn that he had shook the hands of Prince Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, two of the men who had assassinated Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin.
That's fascinating murder. What's the difference? There's a great deal of difference. Not to me.
Though Hammer's Rasputin the Mad Monk was largely fictional, partly to avoid the lawsuit that had hit MGM's Rasputin and the Empress 3 decades earlier, Lee buried himself in research for the role and clearly relished the opportunity.
When I go to confession, I don't offer God small sins, petty squabbles, jealousies. I offer him sins worth forgiving.
The film was shot back-to-back with Prince of Darkness, using the same cast, crew and sets, part of a larger 4-film strategy to get Hammer's finances back on an even keel. Plague of the Zombies went straight into production after Rasputin, followed only days later by The Reptile, again reusing sets and cast. Released as 2 double bills, this quartet of £100,000 films form a key part of Hammer's most creative decade. Though he enjoyed Prince of Darkness, Lee was wary of typecasting. When he played the hero in The Devil Rides Out, a film Hammer made at his urging, he said to his fan club, "I have high hopes it will prove, once and for all, that I can be accepted in a completely normal role." He had little interest, therefore, when he was sent Anthony Hines' script for Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, and was also unhappy with the content, feeling that it had nothing to do with Stoker's character. He rejected it, and then got a phone call from studio head James Carreras. Dracula had become such a financial necessity to Hammer that the new film had been announced in their pre-sales brochure before there was even a synopsis. More than that, Carreras had pre-sold the film to US distributor Warner 7 Arts on the understanding that Lee would appear. Carreras begged Lee to reconsider, but the actor was adamant.
I said, because this is not Bram Stoker, it's totally wrong, and I don't want to do it, and I'm not going to. Goodbye.
The producer then played his trump card, telling Lee that the jobs of everyone at Hammer depended on him playing Dracula once more.
So what do I do? Am I going to be held responsible for putting 90 to 100 people out of work? How could I? So I did them, and that is the only reason why. It certainly wasn't for money.
Terence Fisher was once again set to direct, but a car accident left him with a broken leg, so cinematographer Freddie Francis stepped in to deliver a stylishly shot film that used the effective matte paintings of Peter Melrose to bring Dracula out of the countryside and into the city. The film opens as it means to go on, with blood and death. The vampire's sexuality is back front and centre, with Veronica Carlson's Maria losing her innocence in symbolic fashion. Hammer's well-known love of cleavage is better used here than in any other film.
Zena, you've got more boyfriends than you can remember.
Compare promiscuous tavern wench Zena to buttoned-up Maria. But after Maria's encounter with Dracula...
Have a drink of this. It'll do you good.
The point is brought home when she is completely in the Count's thrall, hugging his coffin. To an extent, this is Hammer following the old steps with added blood and lower necklines, but the film treads new ground as well.
I'm an atheist, sir.
Leading to this memorable scene.
You must do it now. Pray. You must pray. I can't.
The idea that faith is the key component of staking was one that Lee hated but audiences loved, and of all the additions to vampire lore, this seems the truest to the spirit of Stoker's intentions.
You should swear by Almighty God, but you have denied yourself this.
More important is the shift in the story's motivation. All previous films had been driven by vampire hunters, but here the motor of the plot comes from Dracula himself. Resurrected from his frozen state by a careless priest, something of a letdown after the elaborate ritual of Prince of Darkness, Dracula returns to his castle to find...
Who has done this thing?
With the help of the priest, whom he enslaves, the Count embarks on a quest for vengeance against the Monsignor who has barred him from his home, targeting...
the niece of the Monsignor.
This is the first film in which Dracula is indisputably the lead. Which is a questionable decision because we're not supposed to be rooting for the bad guy. But Hammer had recognised that, whether we were supposed to be or not, we were always on the side of Lee's magnetic Count.
Now my revenge is complete.
And although the resolution is a weak one, it leads to a spectacular climax.
Get that thing out of my sight!
Cleverly using that faith-based staking to redeem the guilt-ridden priest.
Quies in celis, sanctificator nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua.
If Lee was doing Dracula Has Risen from the Grave against his will, then there was no sign of it in his performance. Of his first 3 Dracula films, Lee later said that they still had the elements to keep hope alive. Practically a ringing endorsement from the notoriously hard-to-please actor, but containing an implication of what was still to come.
His name was Count Dracula.
In the summer of 1969, Hammer was preparing to reboot the series with a new star, and Christopher Lee was happy to let them. Neither of them could have known that the franchise, and Lee's role in it, was not even half finished.
Count Dracula is alive.
Join us next time when we'll see how the films of Hammer's Dracula franchise pushed Lee up to and then beyond his breaking point. Thanks for watching, and as always, particular thanks to our Patreon subscribers who voted this to be our next franchise review and whose support makes these specials possible.